Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your weekly deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Rick Spair, and joining me as always is Laura.
Hi, Rick, and hello, everyone listening on this Sunday. We've got a really meaty story today, one that I think is going to ripple far beyond the country where it just happened.
It really might. We're talking about a Chinese court ruling handed down in late April and reported by Bloomberg and NPR over the past few days that says companies cannot fire workers just to replace them with AI.
That's right, and I want listeners to understand the significance up front. This is the first time a major economy has produced a clear judicial precedent saying that swapping a human for a model, purely to save money, is not a lawful reason to terminate a contract.
Let's set the scene a little. The case came out of Hangzhou, the eastern Chinese city that is home to Alibaba, DeepSeek, and a long list of well-known AI startups. The ruling was issued by the Hangzhou Intermediate People's Court.
And the worker at the center of the case is named Zhou. He had joined a tech firm back in November of 2022 as a quality assurance supervisor, earning 25,000 yuan a month, which is about $3,655 US.
His job, and this is the part that makes the case especially ironic, was to verify the accuracy of answers generated by large language models. So Zhou was essentially the human in the loop, the human who was checking on the machine.
Exactly. And that's such a poetic detail because it shows just how quickly the goalposts can move. The very person who was hired to babysit the AI ended up being deemed redundant by the same kind of AI he was monitoring.
So what happened to Zhou specifically? Walk us through the timeline of the dispute because the details really matter here for understanding why the court came down the way it did.
Sure, according to the court documents, the company decided to lean more heavily on AI for the QA work, and they offered Zhou a reassignment. The new role came with a salary cut from 25,000 yuan down to 15,000 yuan a month.
That's a 40% pay cut, which is enormous in any market and especially brutal for a senior tech worker who had been doing the job for several years. And I can absolutely understand why he would refuse that demotion.
Right, and when Zhou refused the reassignment, the company terminated him outright. They argued that the rise of AI in their workflow constituted what Chinese labor law calls a major change in objective circumstances, which is one of the legal grounds for ending a contract.
That phrase, major change in objective circumstances, is the legal hinge of the entire case. Can you explain what kinds of situations Chinese labor law normally has in mind when it uses that language?
Happy to. Historically, that clause has been applied to things like a factory closing down, the company being dissolved, a business unit being eliminated, or some external shock that genuinely makes the original contract impossible to fulfill. Things outside the company's control.
So natural disasters, regulatory shutdowns, structural reorganizations, that kind of thing. Not a voluntary management decision to install a new piece of software because the boardroom thinks it will improve margins next quarter.
Precisely. And that distinction is the heart of the ruling. The Hangzhou court explicitly said that adopting AI was a voluntary move by the company to stay competitive. It was a business choice, not an unforeseeable catastrophe imposed from outside.
And once the court framed it that way, the conclusion almost writes itself. If automation is a voluntary management choice, then the cost of that choice cannot just be dumped onto the worker who happens to be standing in the way.
That's the language they used too. The judges said the company had shifted the risks of advancing technology onto its employees, which they considered fundamentally unfair under the existing labor framework. The dismissal was ruled unlawful and compensation was ordered.
Let's pause and think about why this matters. Because at first glance, listeners might say, okay, this is one worker in one Chinese city. Why are we devoting an entire episode to a single labor case?
Great question, and I want to give a few answers. First, China is the second largest economy in the world and arguably the most aggressive deployer of frontier AI inside enterprises right now. So precedents that emerge there carry real weight.
Second, this is genuinely the first ruling of its kind from a major jurisdiction. Western labor courts have not yet produced a comparable AI-specific judgment, even though we've been talking about AI-driven layoffs in the United States and Europe for years now.
And third, the legal logic is portable. The reasoning the Hangzhou court used, that automation is voluntary and therefore companies must bear the risk, is exactly the kind of argument that plaintiffs' lawyers in California, New York, Berlin, and Paris are going to start citing.
Let's connect this to a story we covered just last week. We did an episode on Snap announcing 1,000 layoffs and $500 million in cost cuts with explicit references to AI-driven workforce restructuring.
Right, and that's actually a really useful contrast. In the United States, at-will employment makes a Snap-style restructuring legally clean, even when AI is the explicit reason. In China, that same restructuring would now potentially be unlawful if not handled correctly.
So a company like Snap could not simply replicate that strategy in its Chinese subsidiary without major legal exposure. That has real operational implications for any multinational running enterprise AI deployments inside China.
And it's not just American companies. European firms with Chinese operations, Japanese firms, Korean firms, anyone deploying generative AI in their Chinese workflows now needs to rethink how they handle the human side of the transformation.
Let's talk about what the court said companies should do, because that's the practical question every HR department is going to be asking right now. What's the playbook the ruling lays out?
The court was actually pretty clear about this. If a company wants to automate a job function, they need to negotiate with the affected employee, offer meaningful retraining, or provide a reasonable reassignment that doesn't amount to a punitive demotion.
And the word reasonable is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The court specifically rejected the alternative role offered to Zhou because the 40% salary cut was deemed unreasonable on its face, regardless of any retraining promises.
Right. So you can't just offer a worker a token role at a fraction of their salary, call it a reassignment, and consider your obligations met. The court is essentially saying the offer has to be made in good faith.
I want to push back a little on the framing here because there's a real economic counter-argument. Some economists would say this kind of ruling raises the cost of automation and ultimately slows productivity growth, which hurts everyone in the long run.
That's a fair concern, and I take it seriously, but I'd respond two ways. First, the ruling doesn't ban automation. It just says you have to share the transition costs with the people displaced by it.
That's a really important nuance. The court isn't saying you can't deploy AI. They're saying you can't externalize the human cost of deploying AI onto a single worker without due process and reasonable accommodation.
And second, there's a growing body of research suggesting that abrupt, unmanaged automation actually destroys more value than it creates because of the social costs, the consumer demand collapse, and the loss of institutional knowledge inside the firm.
Let's talk about the broader regulatory context for a minute. We've been tracking the European Union AI Act trilogue collapse, the Pentagon procurement reset, and now this ruling out of China. Is there a pattern emerging globally?
I think there is, and the pattern is essentially that governments and courts are finally catching up to the pace of enterprise AI deployment. For 2 or 3 years, companies got to move first and ask permission later.
And now the bill is coming due in different forms in different jurisdictions. The European Union focuses on AI system risk classification. The United States is fighting over procurement and First Amendment issues. And China is opening a labor law front.
That's a really nice synthesis. And what's interesting is that each jurisdiction is using its existing legal tradition to address the AI moment. The European Union uses regulation, the United States uses litigation and procurement, and China uses labor law.
Let's get speculative for a minute. If you're a chief human resources officer at a Fortune 500 company watching this ruling, what changes about your AI deployment strategy starting tomorrow morning?
A few things. First, you start documenting the human impact assessment of every AI rollout much more carefully. Second, you build out genuine retraining programs, not just compliance theater. Third, you renegotiate your global mobility and severance frameworks.
And I'd add a fourth, which is that you probably need to start engaging with works councils, unions, and employee representatives much earlier in the AI deployment cycle. The era of stealth automation is ending fast.
I completely agree, and honestly, I think the smart companies are going to view this not as a compliance burden, but as a competitive advantage. The firms that handle the AI transition humanely are going to retain better talent and avoid expensive litigation.
There's also a public relations dimension here that we shouldn't ignore. If you're a brand, having a high-profile case where you fired someone because an AI took their job is a publicity disaster you really cannot recover from quickly.
Right, just ask any number of companies that have made the news for tone-deaf layoff announcements over the past few years. The reputational cost is real, and it compounds over time as the workforce becomes more skeptical of management intentions.
Let's pivot to what this means for the AI vendors themselves. If you're OpenAI, Anthropic, or one of the Chinese frontier labs selling enterprise software, does this ruling change how you go to market?
I think it absolutely should. Vendor pitches that emphasize headcount reduction as the primary return on investment are going to face a chillier reception and legal review. The smart vendors will reframe around augmentation, productivity per worker, and capability expansion.
That reframing is already happening in some quarters, but it's been more marketing than substance. This ruling might force the substance to actually catch up to the marketing language about humans and AI working together side by side.
One thing I want to flag for listeners is that this is a single ruling from a single intermediate court. It's not a Supreme People's Court decision yet, and it's not embedded in a new statute. The legal weight could still evolve.
That's a really important caveat. Chinese case law operates differently than the American common law tradition. Lower court rulings don't automatically bind higher courts, although they do influence the broader legal interpretation and signal regulatory direction.
But what I think is really telling is the timing. This ruling came out within days of the European Union AI Act trilogue collapse and the Pentagon procurement reset we covered. There's clearly a global moment of regulatory recalibration happening in real time.
Before we wrap, let me ask you the big picture question. 5 years from now, when historians look back at how the world adjusted to enterprise AI, do you think this ruling will be remembered as a turning point?
I think it might be, yes. Not necessarily because of its direct legal effect, but because it crystallized an argument that was floating around in the academic literature into a concrete judicial decision in a major economy. That's how precedents start.
And the argument it crystallized is essentially that the productivity gains of AI shouldn't be captured entirely by capital, while the costs are imposed entirely on labor. That's a very old debate dressed up in very new technological clothing.
Exactly. And I think we're going to be revisiting this theme dozens of times over the coming years on this podcast. The Hangzhou ruling is just the opening act of what's going to be a much longer global conversation.
Listeners, if you want to dive deeper, the original Bloomberg coverage from May 2nd and the NPR story from May 1st are both excellent starting points. Cation Global also has a really thorough write-up of the legal reasoning.
And if you're working in HR, legal, or AI strategy at any company with Chinese operations, this is a story you should be circulating internally. The implications go well beyond a single dismissal in a single Chinese city.
Laura, thanks as always for the sharp analysis. I always learn something new when we dig into these stories together. And this one in particular gave us a lot of angles to consider for the road ahead.
Thanks, Rick. It's been a great conversation. And to our listeners, please keep sending us your story ideas and feedback. We genuinely read every message, and we love hearing what topics matter most to you.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.